we start with learning outcomes. The aim of this module is to acquaint the students with the growing importance of foreign trade policy and its impact on the economy. After going through this lesson, you shall be able to explain nature of India's trade policy, trace India's trade policy regime, pre and post reform, describe objectives, salient features and analysis of foreign trade policy of 2015 to 2020, emphasize areas for effective implementation of FTP, and finally evaluate the FTP of 2015 to 2020. Then we have introduction. The economic reform process introduced in the beginning of the 1990s with the focus on liberalization has enabled increased integration of the Indian economy with the rest of the world. An important component of the reform process has been the reform of India's external sector. The economic reform process entailed wide-ranging decontrol which significantly liberalized trade policy regime. The liberalized trade policy eliminated quantitative restrictions and reduction in tariff rates. The magnitude of shift in trade policy lies in the fact that policies should adapt to developing state of affairs. This has become inevitable in the context of the opening up of Indian economy. Besides looking into both pre and post trade policy regimes, an attempt has also been made to look into some select issues concerning India's trade dynamics. Now we move on to nature of India's trade policy. The foreign trade policy of a country refers to policies and practices that affect and regulate import and export operations. Foreign trade policy includes many laws, decrees, regulations and procedures that are often adopted for different purposes. Such policies will affect foreign exchange, imports, exports, foreign investment and international relations. A foreign trade policy also includes trade promotion policy, which leads to the design and implementation of successful trade promotion and development program. An important component of a country's foreign trade policy is its national export strategy. The national export strategy focuses on promoting and developing those products and markets that offer the best opportunities for a country. There have been a number of phases in the evolution of trade policies depending on the problems facing the Indian economy, the situations of the world economy and ideas regarding the appropriate policies for fostering economic development. The policies adopted were in line with the thinking of a number of economists dealing with development problems and the interactions of trade and development. The important point to note is that pre-reform India's foreign trade policy regime was extremely restraining and essential to the growth strategy. The actual pattern of India's foreign trade is no longer merely based on domestic policies but on the notions and intention of world trade and finance as well. Domestic policies work most effective when the external environment is by and large favorable. India's trade policy regime, pre and post reform. Pre-reform policies. Evolution of India's foreign trade regime since independence has undergone significant changes. The rapid economic development strategy of post-independent India had been one of the self-reliant industrialization under centralized investment planning. Under this strategy, the basic feature of pre-reform trade policy was autocratic in nature. India followed the protectionist policy and adopted different instruments. These instruments to a large extent were dictated by the objectives of the protectionist policy. The primary objective of this protectionist policy were to, first, stabilize balance of payments, second, encourage industrialization, third, fulfill the objectives of self-reliance, fourth, help in reallocation of resources, and fifth, conserve foreign exchange. The selection of instruments adopted for achieving the objectives of the protectionist policy can be classified in two broad groups, tariff and non-tariff measures. These instruments were basically used to bring about changes in price, volume or other parameters relating to tradable commodities and services. India's import and export policy was guided by the Import and Export Control Act of 1947. In 1977, Two additional orders, namely the Import Control Order and Export Control Order, were introduced, and the subsequently annual policy of import and exports was based on these legislations. The import and export policy determines in great detail the import procedure that are applicable to specific products, license, importer's entitlement, as well as other details relevant for the imports of goods and commodities by different categories of importers. The importers were broadly grouped into three categories: actual users for industrial products and non-industrial products, secondly exporters, and thirdly others. The actual users in the first category included enterprises, persons that used to get import license for items earmarked for their own use and not for further sales. These users were entitled to various types of import licenses and could import goods and commodities under these modes alone. Different types of licensing that used to be issued in pre-reform period can be categorized as open journal license, automatic license, supplementary import license, and import through government-owned canalized agencies. In the open journal license category, the components and spare parts used by importers were usually imported to India on the basis of this license. These imports were used by importers in their manufacturing activities. The list of such products which fell under open journal license, restricted items, and banned list used to be released by the government in their annual export-import policy. The government virtually attempted to close the Indian economy to the outside world. Tariff policy has led to a misallocation of resources through the creation of substantial unplanned subsidization and penalizing of various sectors. The nominal rates of tariff had differed widely from the effective rates of tariff, and the joint operations of the import and export incentive have led to the creation of substantial divergence in the domestic resource cost of producing different commodities. Progressively restrictive trade regime insulated the domestic producers of import competing products from international competition with often fair among of high tariffs. India's policy regime was complex and cumbersome. Whatever the merits and demerits of the economic strategy that has been pursued by the government, its implementation has been very poor. The government attempted to close the Indian economy to the outside world. Tariff policy has led to a misallocation of resources through the creation of substantial unplanned subsidization and penalizing of various sectors. In short, the realization of the negative impact of anti-export bias brought about some welcome changes in India's external sector policies during the 1970s. During this period, a number of initiatives in regard to promotion of exports were adopted. To enhance exports, steps were taken to provide export incentives and export services. The government set up two important committees to streamline the policies to suit the liberal trade regime. These were Import-Export Policies and Procedure Committee headed by P.C. Alexander in 1978, and secondly, the Committee on Trade Policies under the chairmanship of Abid Hussain in 1984. It is important to remember that policies relating to trade were liberalized to a great deal in the 1980s as a result of recommendations of these two committees. Licensing and stringent regulations were liberalized, which facilitated to a more open trade regime. However, the decade of the 1980s may be characterized as a very cautious beginning of liberalization process in India. The economic liberalization policies of 1991 included opening of international trade and investment. These reforms have resulted in the shift from inward-oriented policy of the past to an outward-looking policy. Such a break stems from the change in the perception of the trade policy mindset in the country. Then we have post-reform policies. The country began to liberalize under conditions of extreme necessity. Reforms in the external sector of India were intended to integrate the Indian economy with the world economy. The Abid Hussain Committee on Trade Policies in the year 1984 recommended the institution of a stable medium-term trade policy. In line with this recommendation, the government started announcing its trade policy covering the 3-year period. The first policy under 3-year period was of 1985 to 1988. After liberalization, the Union Commerce Ministry announced the integrated foreign trade policy in every 5 years. This is also called EXIM policy. This policy is updated every year with some modification in new schemes. The FTP frame rules and regulations for exports and imports of the country. The first 5-year export and import policy was of 1992-97, which marked a different approach from the earlier trade regimes. The government replaced the previous EXIM policy nomenclature and announced a new foreign trade policy for the period 2004 to 2009. The foreign trade policy of 2009 to 2014 took into consideration the grim scenario of global trade induced by the global financial crisis and announced initiatives to redress the situation. The post-reform trade policy envisages opening of the external sector of the economy, which led to the deregulation and widespread liberalization in the areas of foreign trade, investment and exchange. The current trade policy reforms seem to have been guided mainly by the concern over globalization of the Indian economy, improving competitiveness of industry and adverse balance of payment situation. Liberalizing the system of exports, imports and trade means that trade reforms should penetrate all layers of society if poverty is to be tackled substantially. The objectives of reform relevant for external sector were: first, import replacement to export promotion activities; secondly, increasing the degree of openness of the economy; thirdly, changing the policy regarding foreign capital and investment; fourthly, liberalizing exchange rate regime; fifth, changing the structure of incentives and institutions so as to place greater reliance on the market rather than the state. To achieve these objectives, the most important instruments adopted include: first, a move from quantitative restrictions to tariffs so as to link movements in domestic and foreign prices; secondly, a reduction in average tariff rates and their dispersion across sectors; thirdly, direct promotion of exports such as by reducing export taxes to offset the anti-export bias arising out of import tariffs; fourth, devaluation of the rupee; fifth, liberalization of restrictions on capital inflows and FDI; and finally, a reduction in burdensome bureaucratic procedure such as rules, regulations, procedure, control and red tapeism. These reforms were not introduced as a package in one fell swoop. Under economic reforms, a liberalized trade regime was put in place which marked a significant turnaround from the earlier controlled regime. It was recognized that trade policies, exchange rate policies and industrial policies should form part of an integrated policy framework if the aim was to improve the overall productivity and efficiency of the economic system in general and the external sector in particular. Apart from devaluation of the exchange rate and a move over to a unified market determined exchange rate system in 1993, the new trade policy was characterized by: first, a short negative list of exports and imports; secondly, lowering of the level and dispersion of nominal tariffs; thirdly, withdrawal of quantitative restrictions on imports; fourthly, phasing out of the system of import licensing; fifth, encompassing significant changes in the system of export incentives; and sixth, moving away from direct subsidies to indirect export promotional measures. The multi-pronged strategy gradually had its desired effects on the economy and ushered in a phase of a stable and high growth. The rising exports combined with significant surge in capital flows provided opportunities for further liberalization of essential imports from quantitative restrictions. The stability in the exchange rate of the rupee maintained the competitiveness of Indian exports and at the same time prevented the upsurge of cheap imports, which could have fueled protectionist sentiments to gain around and stalled the tariff and non-tariff liberalization measures. The loss of the East European market since the early 1990s was successfully countered by diversifying into newer markets of developing countries of Asia and the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries known as OPEC. Then we have increasing openness. A key aspect of the trade reforms was the reduction in import duties. Non-tariff barriers are generally considered less desirable than tariffs. The most common non-tariff barriers are the restrictions or prohibition on imports maintained through the import licensing requirements. In the Indian context, for several decades, quantitative restrictions on imports of a wide range of products, mainly consumer goods, were justified for balance of payment reasons. Action has been completed on removal of restrictions on tariff lines notified under the WTO cover. Quantitative restrictions are, however, still being maintained in about 5% of tariff lines as permissible under Articles 20 and 21 of GATT on the grounds of health, safety, moral conduct and essential security. There has been a steady decline in both nominal and effective rates of protection. During the post-reform trade policy, a number of distinct changes have been initiated. The main objective of shift in policy were to generate an environment for attaining speedy enhancement in exports, increasing India's share in world's export and building exports on engine of growth. The major changes in trade policy relate to: first, exchange rate regime; second, import liberalization; third, export incentive; fourth, administrative simplification of procedural formalities; and fifth, fostering of transparency. The post-reform trade policy illustrates a distinct change in the insight of a policy makers towards the role of trade in the development of the country. Consequently, exports are seen not merely as a source of financing imports but also as a means of efficiently allocating resources. Accordingly, the present objective of trade policy is globalization of the Indian economy, improving its competitiveness and expansion of exports to ease pressure on balance of payment. The policy has resulted in increase in the volume of trade, and the exports from India also have increased. India's share in world's exports has shown a rising trend. Similarly, India's share in world imports has also shown a rising trend during 1990s to 2010. The RBI has opined that in contrast to fears expressed at the time of opening of the economy, import liberalization policies in conjunction with other external sector and overall structural reforms have, in fact, strengthened the country's external sector since 1990 to 1991. The spirit of liberalization process entails a conscious effort on the part of policy makers to optimize on the opportunities or challenges trade-off. It would be well to remember that the synergy between the domestic and external sector each throwing up its strengths and threats. India has also simplified its foreign investment regime and opened up a number of sectors to foreign direct investment. But one must remember that foreign trade policy alone will not boost competitiveness. To sum up, economic policy is now increasingly led by trade policy reforms which have afforded an export-friendly environment with simplified procedures, beneficial for augmenting India's performance in the export sector. The direction of all such reforms has been on liberalization, globalization and transparency. Over the years, every successive policy measures adopted by the government have strengthened the production base for exports by eliminating bureaucratic botherations and making possible availability of inputs. Now we move on to salient features of foreign trade policy from the year 2015 to 2020. With an aim to make India a significant partner in global trade by 2020, the government announced a 5-year new foreign trade policy in April 2015, which may be integrated with Make in India, Digital India and Skill India initiative. The FTP has the objective of boosting India's exports, making exports an engine of economic growth and employment generation. In order to achieve these objectives, a mix of various policy measures is required, which include number of changes in the area of fiscal policy, institutional design, rationalization of procedures, diversification of export basket and penetration into new markets for enhancing trade prospects in the global market. All these require improved export infrastructure. The following are the salient features of foreign trade policy of 2015 to 2020. The first is the policy is made product wise and location wise. Secondly, the policy includes long and medium term strategy to enhance trade competitiveness. Thirdly, introduction of merchandise exports from India schemes and services exports from India scheme to boost outward shipments. Fourth, several incentives for exporters and units in special economic zones. Fifth, export promotion mission to take on board state government. Sixth, unlike annual reviews, FTP will be reviewed after 2.5 years. Seventh, higher level of support for export of defense, farm produce and eco-friendly produce. Eighth, give a push to services exports from sectors like entertainment, logistics, architecture, accounting and healthcare. Ninth, simplification of procedure or processes and digitization and e-governance. 10th, facilitating and encouraging export of dual-use items named as SCOMET, which include export of special chemicals, organisms, materials, equipment and technologies. 11th, trade facilitation and ease of doing business. And 12th, online interministerial consultations. Now we move on to analysis of foreign trade policy 2015 to 2020. The policy provides instruments to accelerate export of goods and services and laid out the framework and the logic that will support the objective of doubling the annual export of goods and services to $900 billion in next 5 years of 2015 to 2020. The aim is to enhance India's share in world exports from 2% to 3.5% by 2020. The focus is on sustaining services exports and increasing manufacturing exports side by side, making efforts to improve the ease of doing business. The FTP seems to be guided by the following 4 concerns. First, keeping checks on how much money goes out on account of export incentives given in the fiscal constraints. Secondly, WTO obligations to phase out export subsidies. Thirdly, linking the FTP to the Make in India initiative. And fourthly, improving free trade agreements utilization in trade. The important positive aspects of this policy are as under. First, the setting up of a number of institutions to go forward and strengthening world trade. Following to the WTO agreement and trade facilitation, the setting up of National Committee on Trade Facilitation will help in the implementation of WTO commitments. The aim is to simplify customs procedure to reduce transactions costs for traders. In this area, the policy is expected to coordinate several measures being taken by various ministries and departments to simplify administrative procedures and reduce transaction cost. Secondly, proposes institutions for involving state government in export promotion policy formulation. Thirdly, the boost to e-commerce and service export is well timed and takes into account the shift in the business paradigm. Incentives to e-commerce companies exporting products from sectors with potential for creating jobs. The policy addresses markets and product strategies. It outlines the measures required for trade promotion, including infrastructure development and overall trade ecosystem, including electronic clearance on 24/7 basis. Fourthly, the introduction of a simplified import duty exemption certificate for all exports under the two scheme is expected to make incentives more transparent and non-discretionary. The quantum of export subsidies is lower than the earlier ones. Fifth, introduce a concept of import appraisal mechanism which will be done on a quarterly basis by the Department of Commerce. Sixth, the scheme have been devised for further extending tax breaks to defense, pharma and environment friendly exports. Seventh, the reduction in the specific export obligation under the Export Promotion Capital Goods Scheme. In this scheme, exporters are allowed to import capital goods without duty, subject to their fulfilling an export obligation equivalent to 90% of the total value of imports over a period of 5 years. Such export obligation has now been reduced to 75%. Eighth, the 5-year programming focusing on the ease of doing business, labor orientation and highlighting the importance of special economic zones would bolster the Make in India initiative. Ninth, The incentive scheme under Chapter 3 of the policy have been consolidated into two primary schemes, namely first, the merchandise export from India scheme, and secondly, the service export from India scheme. The MEIS has been introduced for export of goods and replaces 5 different schemes: the Focus Product Scheme, Focus Market Scheme, Agri Infrastructure Incentive Scrip, Vishesh Krishi and Gram Udyog Yojana. Under the scheme, notified goods exported to notified markets would be rewarded on realized FOB value of exports. The rate of MEIS ranges from 2% to 5%. There is now no conditionality attached either to the end use or to the transferability of the scrips. The important aspect relates to higher incentive to agricultural and village industry, eco-friendly and green products, labor-intensive products and products with large number of producers and or exporters, industrial products from potential winning sectors and high-tech products with high earning export potential. The duty paid by using the MEIS would be available as sen-vet credit or drawback. Next, 10th, services exports occupy a key position in India's foreign trade. Its contribution and vibrancy is no longer confined to just information technology but replicated in many other sectors such as telecom, entertainment, logistics, accounting and healthcare. The new SEIS scheme has been extended to all service providers located in India instead of Indian service providers, eliminating the tedium of proving antecedents. The free transferability of scrips and extension of benefits to SEZs applies to SEIS too. 11th, service exporters usually do not need imports, as a result of which some benefits go waste for them. In order to spur growth in service sector, the initiatives undertaken in the present policy will help service exporters who could monetize benefits by trading scrips. They may even be allowed to offset service tax by using these scrips. This will particularly benefit sectors such as education, healthcare, consultancy and architecture that do not import much to sell these in market and encash some of the benefits. The idea is to make the schemes more effective. Then we have 12th, in an attempt to achieve greater policy coherence and mainstreaming of all export incentive schemes, the Department of Commerce will now direct state government to prepare their own export strategies based on the new FTP. The 13th, the policy is for 5 years and this will avoid periodic and unpredictable changes which alter the overall tone of the policy. Instead of making amendments every year, the government will now make a mid-policy review after 2.5 years. The policy is inclusive, having spoken about job creation, agriculture and even mobilizing waste for exports. It is the first time a trade policy has included subjects like the ease of doing business, transaction simplification, speed of approval, etc. So it is positive. The FTP has been aligned with the government's larger vision of promoting manufacturing, digitization and making it more inclusive with greater involvement of states. The policy seeks to tie in foreign trade with major government initiatives like Make in India, Digital India and Skills India. This seems to be more pronounced with the Make in India campaign. Merchandise exports can grow only from the foundations of a sound manufacturing base. Many FTP measures directed at merchandise exports are in alignment with this. Now we move on to areas for effective implementation of FTP. The main problem in the export sector are infrastructural bottlenecks, high transaction cost and complex bureaucratic procedures. In addition, global factors also play an important role. 2 new schemes in the FTP are now fully transferable and can be used to pay customs and excise duties and the service tax. These duty credit scrips will be applied to SEZs also and are likely to give them a boost. Measures have been taken to encourage Indian capital goods industries under the Export Promotion of Capital Goods scheme by reducing specific export obligation to 75% in case of domestic capital goods. This will promote the domestic capital goods industry. With more flexibility, exporters will be able to develop their production capacity more efficiently. Export processing zones have been given much prominence in the new trade policy, and emphasis is on the role of states in improving the infrastructural conditions in the EPZs. Most importantly, states will have to prepare their own strategies, work plans and incentives for capacity building for exports. The states will have to decrease infrastructure bottlenecks and upgrade ports, roads, railways and airports. They will have to install more testing labs and larger trade facilitation centers, including cold storage facilities for pharmaceuticals and perishable products. Exports have been given a thrust, especially at a time when exports of both merchandise and service exports have been languishing. The emphasis of FTP is on supporting both the manufacturing and service sectors, with a focus on improving the ease of doing business. For effective implementation of FTP, it is important to align it to Make in India, Digital India and Skills India initiatives. The policy, though, seems to focus a lot on easing the process, but still exerts its clout on manufacturing in India. In totality, it makes sense to implement all plans and procedures to improve the working of FTP. The focus of FTP has been on simplicity and stability. Accordingly, the implementation of FTP on the one hand needs to realign the multiple schemes with the objective of reducing complexities. On the other hand, it should promote the increased use of technology to reduce the transaction cost and manual compliances. Thus, the FTP's implementation requires turning its attention to sectors where India has inherent advantages like healthcare, education, R&D, logistics, professional services, entertainment as well as services incidental to manufacturing. By extending benefits under EPCG on domestic procurements and offering them more products under MEIS scheme, the policy further seeks to incentivize the exports. The priority areas are technology driven, labor intensive driven and environment driven. Now we move on to the evaluation of policy of 2015 to 2020. Given the backdrop of prevailing global trade environment, the new policy is a bold initiative to increase competitiveness of Indian products. The enterprising objective of FTP is admirable, but the means to get to it will be tested over time. Exports target are essentially cut and dry and temporal. The experts in the field are of the view that the logic of change is lucid, but the building blocks and the instruments continue to be embedded in the legacy of the past. The policy is progressive, but the framework is not new, and the instruments of delivery are a work in progress. It is expected that the policy will enhance the zeal of existing players, particularly operating in the field of service sector, for example, pharma, agricultural and aquaculture, auto ancillaries, handicrafts, among others, and would potentially identify and support new age performers like defense, high-tech, e-commerce and many more. However, one should not have the belief that this in itself would be sufficient to achieve the target. It is also important to keep in mind that the government is likely to forego revenue to the extent of 500 to 2500 crores by way of incentives given under MEIS and SEIS, two units located inside special economic zones. It is good that the government has done away with the many schemes of export promotion and has announced a simplified policy. It combines 5 earlier schemes for good exports into a single scheme, and there is one program for promotion of services exports. The exporters will benefit from these two schemes as they are not the same export promotion concession that existed earlier. The crucial issue is the lack of coordination between different economic agents and ministries operating in silo-like structures. There is no mentioning of how Make in India or Digital India or even the Smart Cities policy can be integrated with the FTP to deliver higher exports of both goods and services. This particular aspect of integration and coordination continue to be the main challenge for India's trade regime. Some of the knowledgeable persons in the field of trade have observed that the rules of the trade game have changed. Rather than negotiating on tariffs, countries now negotiate on non-tariff barriers, including regulatory and licensing issues. However, in India, authorities are still preoccupied with tariffs as the major instrument of regulating foreign trade and thereby ignoring the discussion on intellectual property rights, trade facilitation, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, climate change and the like. India needs to evolve beyond tax breaks for manufacturers. The only way to ensure that India becomes an export powerhouse is to slot it into global supply chains. This does not require tax breaks. It requires freer trade and a realistic exchange rate policy and better infrastructure. The government at least recognizes the need for infrastructure. Its push to improve road, rail and ports is worthy of approval. Industry lobbies hailed the policy, especially the steps to reduce complexity and multiplicity. However, the point is that the driving force for promotion of exports needs to be structural, systematic reforms. In this regard, consistency in the policy is very important. The FTP is merely highlighting the current services environment without getting into prescriptions and identifying thirst areas. More was expected from the FTP here. Nevertheless, the policy is a welcome roadmap for India's foreign trade. Any export benefits the government may give will help, but there is no reason for unbridled pessimism given the sluggish global situation. Now we will make a summary of what we have discussed so far. We start with, in pre-reform period, India's trade regime was considered most restrictive due to its complex nature and wide number of tools used as policy instruments. Then we have seen the trade regime was based on a complex system of licensing. India's trade policy heavily relied on quotas rather than of tariffs. Imports were regulated through a licensing system without any policy prescription. Then we have seen economic reform of 1991 brought major liberalization changes in the external sector. The new trade policy reversed the direction followed for decades. The speed of trade reform quickened a shift from quantitative import controls to protective system based on tariffs. Then we have seen that tariff protection reduced, relaxed and simplified the restrictive import licensing regime. Import licensing was totally abolished with respect to imports of most machinery, equipment and manufactured intermediate products. Then we have discussed that policy focus was primarily on liberalization of capital goods and inputs for industry to encourage domestic and export oriented growth. Then we have seen the economic reform helped India to eliminate export pessimism of 1950s and 1960s. It belied the argument that export pessimism, for example, protectionism in industrialized countries or economic nationalism based on the belief that domestic protection for domestic consumption is economically superior to trade is right course. Then we have discussed the foreign trade policy of 2015 and 2020. This underlines the importance of increasing exports and facilitates these imports which are required to stimulate the economy. The policy is built around two major objectives. First, to double the percentage share of global merchandise trade within next 5 years, and secondly, to act as an effective instrument of economic growth by giving a thrust to employment generation. Finally, the new policy is essentially a roadmap for developing international trade and may be modified midway to meet the changing dynamics of foreign trade.